IDC International Radio. From Israel to the world.
Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.
You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. I'm Etai Handman, and we are at the ICT's 18th Annual World Summit on Counterterrorism. Today in studio, I am joined by a special guest, Dr. Qanta Ahmed, Associate Professor of Medicine, State University of New York in the United States. Dr. Ahmed, how are you doing today?
Good morning, Etai. Boker Tov and Shana Tova.
Boker Tov, Shana Tova to you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. It has been a hectic conference with many, many workshops, but I'd like to start off with the fact that you gave a very interesting keynote address on the first day of the conference. Maybe you can give our listeners a little bit of a highlights from your keynote address.
I was here to share with the community, the elite counterterrorism community that gathers here, about the aftermath of ISIS in Kurdistan, about the plight of the Yazidi survivors who experienced genocide at the hands of ISIS, about the extraordinary Kurdish people who are psychologists helping rebuild these shattered lives, and about the heroism of the Peshmerga, who identify strongly not just the Kurdish people, but the Peshmerga with the IDF and with Israel. I had a lot to say about that.
Maybe a few highlights, what's something specific that you were able to highlight to the crowd?
First of all, that people should understand the battle against ISIS was really fought on the ground, and a huge component of that victory of repelling ISIS from Iraqi territory was by the Kurdistan's fighters, the Peshmerga. Peshmerga means those who stare death in the face, and they are both a male and female force. More than 40% of the combat troops in Peshmerga are women. Only the IDF comes close, with about 33% women in the IDF. So they're very similar. Women can command men. Much of the campaign, initially, they had very limited resources. They did not have even a smartphone. They did not have army boots. They were relying on villagers to feed them. They were sometimes ferrying fighters to the front line in their own vehicles, using their own monies to finance the battle. It took a while for the world to start supporting their efforts. And they were doing this because the Yazidi people, who are amongst the world's most ancient monotheists, thousands of years old, had been designated as infidels by ISIS. And in August 2014, all of the young men were rounded up and summarily executed, beheaded, assassinated by ISIS. Women and children were abducted and immediately sold into sexual slavery. Some of the victims, many of the victims were raped multiple times. I'm a seasoned physician. When you read the academic literature on the trauma to these people, the groups are divided between those raped less than 20 times, more than 20 times, more than 40 times. One 8-year-old girl raped more than 100 times by ISIS. So this was a devastated community that is being rebuilt. Kurdistan, as you know, is in the northern part of Iraq. Kurdistan has been semi-autonomous, but is in a very tense relationship with Baghdad, which frequently turns off the funding for Kurdistan, refuses to directly allow the United States to arm Kurdistan. The arms come to Baghdad, and therefore the Peshmerga are in this precarious position, and despite that have fought and won a heroic battle. They do acknowledge international coalition support. And for your listeners, what I didn't share in the keynote address, is that amongst the average Kurdish people, not the Peshmerga troops, there were a couple of rumors that are commonly held amongst the public. One was when the Peshmerga were at critical closure of the battle, really in a precarious position with ISIS, they received unexpected aerial cover, which was not from the United States. The public thinks it was from the Israeli Air Force. And to me, that sounded feasible. I'm not a military or political person, so I have no access to whether that's true. And the other rumor that the Kurdish public would say is that on the ground were some IDF forces wearing Peshmerga uniforms, shoulder to shoulder, fighting with the Peshmerga. I thought it was a marvelous story. I went to the Peshmerga I met and I asked them, and I did not get a confirmation or denial. But I like the idea. They very much recognize Israel has the same values. And the Kurdish people and the Yazidi people were speaking actually about not just Israel, but Jewish memory. And their words to me were, and I'm quoting, is we know the Jewish memory. We know the Jews for a very long time had no nation, for centuries had no state, no country, and they were one people. And just like their story, we have been one nation, we have been one people, and we've been denied a state. The Kurds have been documented for over 7 centuries as an independent race. They have faced multiple persecutions, multiple genocides. The Yazidis, who are a small section of the Kurdish people, faced their 74th genocide with ISIS. So there is a huge resonance between Kurdistan and Israel. And Kurds, every average Kurd knows the name of Benjamin Netanyahu. They even call him Bibi Netanyahu because he was one of the only international leaders to recognize their political right for independence. So I was here talking to the counterterrorism community while we're immersed in academics and strategics, which is at an astonishingly high level. I wanted to bring to them the faces not only of the survivors, I don't call them victims, survivors of ISIS, but also the men and women that faced off ISIS in person. The women were heroic. I'm not very tall. Many of the Peshmerga women are below my height. When they heard ISIS was coming, they said to their husbands, honey, you watch the kids. I'm going to the front line. And I said to one woman who had 3 children, how could you leave your children? I was in the city of Duhok, which is 30 kilometers from Mosul, where, as you know, ISIL lay siege. How could you leave your kids when ISIS was roaming the neighborhood? She said, if I don't safeguard my nation, I cannot safeguard my children.
It's a very, very interesting comment and a very beautiful outlook on how to combat the extremism of ISIS. And I can confirm I've also heard those rumors about the IDF working with Kurdistan. I can't confirm one way or the other. I don't have the information at hand, but I can say that I've heard those rumors before. And I can confirm that I know that Israel has always had very interesting and deep relations with the Kurdish people all over the region. And it's a sore spot between Israel and Turkey specifically because of Turkish designation of the PKK as a terrorist organization and Israel being an ally, if you will, of the Kurdish people as a whole. I wanted to ask you, as I find it to be extremely interesting, you are by profession a medical doctor. How did you get into, I guess, how did you evolve into the topic of radical Islam?
So, I'm a medical doctor, but I'm also a believing Muslim that observes Islam. And on September 11th, I was in Saudi Arabia where I was practicing critical care medicine, trauma critical care medicine, and watched the towers go down. New York has always been my adopted home. And that was the first moment as a Muslim I realized somebody's taking Islam and weaponizing it into a lethal, devastating distortion of what Islam was supposed to be. And that began my intellectual curiosity. I wrote a book about that. And as I wrote the book, I became more involved in public opinion and very quickly learned about the concept of Islamism and that Israel has faced Islamism, radical Islam, longer than any other nation in the world. And that led me to my first trip to Israel 5 years ago. Today I'm here on my 11th trip, and part of what I did after meeting the Peshmerga and hearing how they feel about the IDF, I felt ashamed to say I'd been here almost a dozen times and not made the effort to meet active troops. And so this intellectual journey has led me to become a public voice in any English language media on 4 continents, explaining Islamism is heinous, it is an imposter, it is a political totalitarian ideology, it is not Islamophobic to say it, and it's for Muslims to reclaim the conversation and expose and separate it from true Islam. And as a result, earlier this week, I was able to go into the belly of Islamism, a place that I've only read about and written about, which were inside the Hamas tunnels with the remarkable Gaza division that is stationed at the southern border at Ain Hashloshea. I'm not able to say it very well.
Very well.
And there I went with, incredibly young soldiers and one commander, Colonel Kobe, who led me to the Indian Chai Tunnel. I was able to understand how a farmer found it coming up out of his field, went deep into its belly and walked in there as far as I could until I told the Colonel Kobe, maybe we don't have to go too much deeper. Incredible to see the sophisticated engineering, the finished concrete, the electrical supplies, the way one tunnel goes straight to Khan Yunis, one tunnel comes straight into Israel. The engineering is remarkable and chilling. the amount of energy, the amount of technology and money that has gone into what is one of the prime central tenets of Islamism, which is a cosmic, not mortal, a cosmic enmity with anything Jewish, Judaic, Jewry, or Israel or Zionist. That is their mission. A complete departure from Islam, which recognizes that the Torah is our book. The Torah is the book of the Jews. We respect, we not just respect, we honor and love Moses, and we accept Moses' word. One of the bravest characters in the Quran is whom we call Harun, Aaron, the brother of Moses. So this was, to be inside there was just extraordinary for me. And I also understood in my apprehension what it must be like to be an Israeli soldier going into these tunnels and not knowing what's coming out the other way. The beauty of what I was doing is I was also accompanied by some Muslim soldiers that are in the IDF, and therefore we experienced this together, not only one young soldier and one older Muslim, but later I'd specifically requested, because I've met with Muslim Peshmerga in Kurdistan, I've been with the Pakistani Frontier Corps in South Waziristan, which had just repelled back the Taliban. And now I was able to meet members of the 528 Bedouin Battalion, the Bedouin battalion that has been serving the IDF. And many of the soldiers sat there and told me, my father and my grandfather were serving the IDF. And I asked them, how can you tally that with being Muslim? They said, this is our country. As Muslims, it's our duty and honor to defend our country. This is the country that feeds us. This is the country that protects us. And they reminded me of what many Muslims do not remember in the United States or in the UK, where there are lots of fractions, or in France, let's say, that the Muslim has three duties. One is to herself, her body, preserve the body, preserve your health. One is to God. It's our duty to remember there is one God and worship him. And a very important and equally important duty is the duty to society. And this is what these Muslims were embodying. Some of the Bedouin soldiers actually face incredible hardship. They're not feeling comfortable to tell their families they've enlisted. One of them told me, I told my family I was working in the factory in the north and would only come home occasionally, hide the uniform before he came home. Eventually this tension was resolved after a few years. I learned from the Muslim soldiers how they celebrate Rosh Hashanah, Eid, Ramadan, Christmas all together with their fellow IDF soldiers. They learned about each other. They have an enormous sense of brotherhood, not just with the Muslim IDF, but the wider IDF. And honestly, I was incredibly humbled by them. And it is an important aspect of the IDF in Israel that is poorly understood. I already know it. I'm an ambassador for the Technion. I've raised money for Hadassah. So I have seen the true Israel, which is multi-faith, egalitarian, and truly integrated in a way that is not depicted outside of the world. When I said to them, how do you feel that you're training your weapons on Gaza? 2 million Palestinians are living there. We are not at war with the Palestinians, explained the Muslim soldiers to me. We are not at war with Islam. We are at war with Hamas, and that is my war too. So it was overwhelming. I have a few photographs the IDF has allowed me to share. Some of the photographs we were not allowed to take because the Bedouin soldiers are not public figures like me. So I understand that. But I hope to be able to share that with any audience that is willing to learn.
You have been called by your critics a Zionist in Muslim guise. You are a practicing Muslim. You are a believer. You are not just a practicing Muslim. You have a great faith. How does that make you feel when your critics say that to you?
Well, I mean, I remember the exact person who said it, who was a very prominent Saudi executive that had been for a long time an advocate for me. And ultimately, this is how he felt he was denouncing me to a group of Muslim professionals. And I lost a number of professional links as a result of that. To me, being a Zionist is not a slur. Being a Zionist, and in fact, I've written an article about myself, calling myself an accidental Zionist.
That was my follow-up question.
So to me, being a Zionist means I believe Israel has a right to exist. I believe Israel has a right to exist politically. Israel was formed just a year after Pakistan. The country of my parents' heritage was formed itself as a Muslim Zion. I believe Kurdistan will one day be a Zion. It's a Zion in waiting. But I also believe Israel has the right to exist based on what the Quran tells me. Well, the Quran tells me that Jerusalem belongs to the Jews. I have no question about that. And I don't see why a Jewish child cannot grow up today knowing that there is at least one nation for this child, when a Muslim child can grow up and know that we have homes in over 183 nations around the world, and at least 56 Muslim nations where we can live. I also know the Quran says to me that is the world not big enough? Should you find difficulty somewhere? Should you not be able to migrate? Have I not provided you an adequate world? So I see no conflict within supporting Israel's right to exist. If that makes me a Zionist, so be it. I'm a pragmatist. I have seen Zionism in work, which is not, as many in America would suggest, any form of apartheid, but quite the opposite. It's empowering minorities, where I have visited inside Israel, minorities that are brutally persecuted in Pakistan. I visited them in Haifa. The Ahmadi Muslim community, as you know, is often murdered for their beliefs. And in Israel, the Israeli government provides them land. The Israeli local council provide them money to take care of their cemeteries. In Pakistan, created to prevent Muslims from being persecuted in the old British India, the graves of Ahmadis are exhumed and they are persecuted not only in life but in death. So tell me how Zionism is not a humanist and pluralist vision of how humanity can live.
It's a very interesting outlook. And if I may ask, how did you come to such an outlook?
I'd say I've been blessed with incredible opportunities to meet any number of people from this country. I would say because of my intellectual journey about Islamism, that ultimately physically led me to Israel. I also have an indefatigable curiosity. I'm a woman that follows her curiosity to the nth degree. Sometimes it can put me in some precarious places, but mostly it's because, and I encourage anybody listening, if they have positive views or negative views or animus towards Israel, hold that thought and come and meet Israelis. You can meet Israelis all over the world, but you will not have realized what Israel is until you come here. You are among the people where if you greet, as often I can't tell who is Muslim, who is Jewish, who is Christian here. You can greet them with the appropriate greeting and people will respond to you whether or not it's their faith. I'm free to worship here in a way that I am as free in America or as free in England, less free to do so in Pakistan than I am here, less free to do so in Saudi Arabia. I can go inside a church here, I can go inside a synagogue here. And also, I've received confirmation of this when I go to Egypt, when I go to Jordan, important Muslim Arab allies of Israel, and I see their perspectives of Israel. My Egyptian driver, when I was in Cairo last year, could quote to me the speeches that Anwar Sadat delivered at the Knesset to Menachem Begin. And I asked, how did Anwar Sadat feel about making peace with Israel? And the driver said to me, who's just an ordinary Cairene, that's an important person to talk to, an ordinary person from Cairo. He said, Sadat was just very sad the rest of the Arab world did not follow. And so I think there is a huge groundswell of support for Israel. I have no doubt with this climate that we're learning about at this meeting, particularly about Iran and about Hezbollah, that there are many Sunni allies that are deeply aligned with Israeli interests that are communicating at levels that, I would never know about. So I see no discordance between being someone who can be called a Zionist as a slur or who can admit quite proudly that she is a Zionist without any conflict with the depths of my faith as a Muslim or my values as an American.
You have had quite an interesting career, and I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about the fact that you are a physician in practice, and now you've taken, as you said, this intellectual journey through radical Islamism? How do you combine the two? What are you able to provide, not just as a physician and not just as an intellectual, but combine the two? Where can the combination be applied?
What an interesting question. It was never my plan to be a physician. This was my father's decree. I was 15. I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, and my father was the ultimate authority, and that wasn't going to happen. I was enrolled in medical school. And ultimately, it gave me incredible skills. First of all, it's a humbling career. Being a physician means I meet with humanity in all its conditions. It's the best way to understand a society, to look after people in times of sickness and illness and bereavement and other things. It also honed incredible powers of observation and listening and communication. And I find the skills that a doctor has are rather like the skills an investigative journalist has. I'll ask you a story. I'll ask somebody else a story. I want to see if the dots connect. Maybe I missed something. Let me go back. So it's given me incredible powers of listening and observation. But there's another ability that I never underestimate, and I'm very grateful for, is human beings respond uniquely to doctors. And it doesn't matter which culture you're in. So many of the places when I visited the Pakistani military frontier corps, hugely brave soldiers on the sharp end of the conflicts in the Northwest frontier. When I visited these battle-weary Peshmerga colonels and generals and lieutenants and infantry. When I visited the Bedouin battalion and the Gaza division and Commander Colonel Kobe's men and women, after a while, they start talking to me about things impacting their health or things that they are concerned about. Many soldiers, and I now practice as a sleep specialist, are experiencing profound sleep disturbances. And so there is an incredible amount of trust that strangers invest in you when you are a doctor. I never exploit that trust. I'm very grateful for it, but it gives me an immediately valuable view that might not be accorded somebody that doesn't have that background. I'm not suggesting that I can replace or be equal to any of the incredible academic experts that are here. I've been sitting here with my notebooks and learning, but there is an additional value that doctors can provide. And I think there's one other final value, and I think this is, I can't remember exact quote, but it came out of the Cairo Geniza, the documents that were found, ancient documents about ancient doctors from Jewish history, who always said that physicians have to be the torch bearers into darkness in terms of morality. Remember, and you know much better than I, of Nazi ideology. Part of Nazi ideology's embodiment came when the German medical academic community embraced eugenics and embraced Nazi ideology. Once the doctors had lost their moral compass, genocide could happen. And therefore, I think as a British citizen and an American citizen and a doctor, it's my moral responsibility to expose injustices. And interestingly, in Islam, the C-, the bare minimum of being a Muslim, is to expose injustice. If you're able to see injustice and prevent it by taking physical action, do it. Obviously, I can't do that. If you're able to see injustice and say something, you have to use your voice. And if for some reason you're not gifted with the voice and platform that I've been fortunate to have, then you must at least think it in your heart. Those are basic Islamic teachings. So I found my father, who was very instrumental in me becoming a doctor, gave me a remarkable gift that is serving really a lot of my passions. The way I do it is I'm here on my annual vacation. So my vacation is spent amongst counterterrorism experts. And on Monday morning, when I get back to New York, I'm back in office hours and I'll see my American patients. And it actually keeps both of my lives very vibrant to do that.
I have to ask you, because I think it's very interesting how deep a faith you have. And in our conversation right now, you have listed quite a few very interesting beliefs that you have and teachings that you believe that that's the true Islam. That is the way that Islam is intended. What do you, or why, or how do you rectify the fact that there are so many religious Muslim imams and others that are perverting the religion and taking what you said and almost giving it the exact opposite meaning?
So, excellent question. And I would suggest to your listeners, if they're interested, last week I published an essay at the request of the Spectator on why I'm Muslim. The question was, why would anyone be Muslim in this age of Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban? And so there is that article is about the basis of my belief. And there was such an outpouring with exactly this. Intellectual British readers saying, well, what about suicide bombing and the Shahadat verse? What about the mistreatment of women in the name of Islam? What about polygamy? What about all these other accusations? And the answer is that much of what passes for Islam, either in the manifestation of a Muslim majority state, think about Afghanistan, think about Saudi Arabia, think about Iran, much of what passes as Islam, think about Salafists in Europe, think about the Wahhabis, among whom I've lived, think about fanatical Shia or Sunni expressions of Islam, is an utter departure from Islam. Islam was first embodied in the revealed word of God, as Muslims believe, in the Quran. The Quran was recorded, first it was orally transmitted to the Prophet, who was chosen because he was illiterate in part, so he could never plagiarize or manufacture the Quran by himself. Later it was transcribed by hand onto vellum, sheep scapula, then eventually paper. And 300 years later came the first body of the hadith and the sunnah, which are reported sayings and recordings and doings. And I think what's happened is that has become much, much bigger at the expense of what the original Quranic message was. Additionally, with Islamism, which is a 20th century construct made across the border in Egypt in 1928 by Sayyid Qutb and followers, is a complete invented neo-Sharia. And we began to see this first in open manifestation in 1979 Iran, where they revived stoning of whoever they thought was defective or deviant, and there had not been a stoning for centuries. In 500 years of Ottoman history, there's a recording only of one stoning. And for readers who really care about it, read the British-Finnish author Sadakat Qadri, also of Muslim origin, who wrote a book called A History of Sharia, Heaven on Earth. Sadakat Qadri, a brilliant treatise of the history of Sharia. So what we see happening, where women who report rape in Pakistan are now incarcerated and they are subject to hudud ordinances, brutal punishments for reporting a rape, that is not Islamic. When we see women are enforced to veil in Iran in chadars, that is not Islamic. When we see women having been prevented to drive in Saudi Arabia until June this year, that is not Islamic. If we think about the first Muslim was Khadija, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad. And she was a wealthy woman. She had been twice widowed. She chose the Prophet as her marriage partner through an intermediary, which was the dignified thing to do at the time. And she was an entrepreneur and financially independent. That was the first Muslim woman. Show me a woman of that caliber in Taliban-occupied Pakistan or Afghanistan. So what we see, and I have every sympathy with the non-Muslim, there are almost no manifestations visible of true Islam in the way that these states are manifested. The persecution not allowed to build a church in Saudi Arabia. In fact, there are monastic ruins centuries old that have been concealed in Saudi Arabia, showing that there were churches on the Arabian Peninsula, possibly at the time of early Islam. So it is what I think is happening is much of Islam is being defined by not only Islamists, but an invented neo-Sharia or distortions of Islam. And there are pockets where you can see real Islam. A good example, and I invite anybody listening, is to go to Kurdistan, where you see the mosques and churches in parallel. In Kurdistan, after ISIS destroyed the churches in Mosul, the Kurds and the local population rebuilt the churches. They had cement, they had mortar. What they didn't have was Catholic iconography. So France donated half a dozen or a dozen and a half Virgin Marys, and they were delivered to Erbil. And the Muslim population in Erbil, which is capital of Kurdistan, greeted the Virgin Marys with a public procession and festivity to welcome the Virgin Mary to the Muslim territory. And she's beautifully, you can see the Virgin Mary in Muslim Kurdish Erbil. Another place is Pakistan's Hunza Valley, where the Ismailis have proven definitively they're very committed to educating children. They have extensively educated children. There is zero radicalization, zero defection to the Taliban, and they're doing it in the name of Islam. The community here in Israel, the Ahmadi community, which of course is exiled from Pakistan, and it has a presence in Britain and Canada and so on, are committed as Muslims to say, we know there are violent verses in the Quran. We know there is advocacy for violent jihad in the Quran, albeit defensive. We eschew that. We think the Quran is both a historical and a contemporary document. We're not in an age of jihad now. We're in an age of debate. And so you will find many areas where true Islam is being manifested. And even Muslims here in Israel, where some of the Bedouin soldiers explained to me I said, why did you join the army? And the Bedouin soldier said, my dad looked at me and said, you know, you're 18 years old. What the hell are you doing at home? Go out there and get a life. And if you don't know what to do, go and join the army. That is happening inside a Muslim family.
Before we wrap up, I really wanted to get your personal thoughts on your feelings on being named the first Muslim woman and first physician in 2010 to receive the Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellow in Science and Religion at the University of Cambridge. What did that make you feel like? How did you feel receiving such an award?
I mean, it was an incredible opportunity. I was dumbfounded when one of the professors from the program, it's actually a selection process, one has to compete for that honor, suggested that I should put myself forward as a potential candidate as a public intellectual. And I thought, oh, really? Am I a public intellectual? I was very sort of shocked by it. And I competed with some very capable people. They really gave me a remarkable opportunity. It's not quite 10 years ago now. Their intention was to increase discourse that focuses on both science and religion. And they had to take a gamble on me when I was much less broadcast, much less published, much less widely known. And they invested in me a unique opportunity, financial funds. And I think it's very humbling. Any number of this, not only recognition, but opportunities are very humbling. And bear in mind that I think many, if not all on the panel, were themselves devoted Christians who really are concerned about the dialogue in the public sphere. And this was funded by Sir John Templeton's fund, then run by the late Jack Templeton, his son. After 9/11, he saw 9/11 happen, and being a person of colossal means, felt it was very important to narrow the gap between faith rather than allow it to deepen, which was the ultimate ambition. So, yes, it was quite humbling.
You're published all over the world in many different newspapers, broadcasts around the world. Where would be a great place for people to go and find some of your publications, but more importantly as well, your book, In the Land of Invisible Women, an account of your experiences as a physician in Saudi Arabia?
Go to my website, QantaAhmed.com, and you'll see everything there.
Excellent. Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here in studio at the ICT World Summit on Counterterrorism. We appreciate you taking the time. We appreciate your visits throughout Israel and visiting the IDF and understanding a little bit better about Israel, and maybe that message can be put out there to the broader community. I really do appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Toda rabba.
Toda rabba. Shalom.